I'm Nathalie Sturgeon. Welcome to Southwest Magazine. Joining me in the studio today are two powerhouses in the field of sociology, research, and law, particularly in nuclear technology. The two work closely with the Pescatawamogatti Nation here in Charlotte County. Dr. Susan O'Donnell is a professor at St. Thomas University in the Sustainability and Environmental Studies program, and Karrie Blaise is a lawyer and founder and legal advocate for Nature's Defense. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks, Nathalie, for having us.
So let's start with a little bit about who you are and sort of how you reached your respective fields.
Me first? Yeah. Sure. Okay, I'm a researcher. I've been a researcher for about 3 decades now, and I gradually moved into the field of technology research. And I actually came to New Brunswick a little more than 20 years ago to work at the National Research Council on technology adoption, it's called, how technology is used in the real world. And then I moved into energy technologies, and then finally, for the last 6 years now, I've been researching nuclear technologies. Yeah.
And so, like Susan, bringing a number of years to this conversation today, and grateful to be here. And so I'm an environmental lawyer. I've been practicing for about a decade now, and specifically on issues of environmental injustice. So working with communities, Indigenous nations, when there is a harm in their community or their territory that's posing a threat to their rights or the health of their environment. I'm originally from Robinson Huron Treaty Territory in Northern Ontario, and so back home I did found an environmental law organization where we provide pro bono legal services on environmental rights issues.
And how did you get there? Like, what was the path to where you are today?
Oh, well, nuclear technology is absolutely fascinating. As a researcher, there's just no end to it. There are so many rabbit holes you can go down. I'm a social scientist. So many rabbit holes you can go down, just so many interesting aspects to it. And I first got into it when I heard that the province was supporting small modular nuclear reactors. And I was like, oh, what's all this about? And I started looking into it, and I found out that what I was finding out on the NB Power site and on the government website is not what I was reading in the academic journals. And so that really piqued my interest to learn more. Like, what are they not telling us? And so that's where I really that's how I really got interested.
Yeah, my foray into the nuclear realm began by looking actually into emergency planning. And are there sufficient, zones for emergency response around the nuclear reactors that we have across Canada? The one here in New Brunswick is the only one in Canada that's actually on the ocean. And then from there, I began working directly with First Nations, nuclearized First Nations who have either a uranium refinery in their backyard or radioactive waste mounds or a nuclear power plant.
For you, is there particular communities that are especially vulnerable in New Brunswick to the things that you've just mentioned?
So today we are on the Passamaquoddy territory, and so here from where we're sat today, that would be the community who is directly affected by the Point Lepreau nuclear generating station. They never gave their consent in the 70s when it was being proposed and developed, and going on today as it operates. That consent remains outstanding.
Okay. So what brings you to Charlotte County?
Okay. Well, there's an institute called the International Oceans Institute. It's based in Dalhousie University in Halifax, and they're having a week-long learning environment specifically for Indigenous leaders in the Wabanaki territory, I believe. There's Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Wolastoqey, Indigenous leaders and people who work for Indigenous communities here, and we're giving presentations. I'm actually giving a presentation on renewable energy today. I will be mentioning nuclear, but I'm mostly going to be talking about renewable energy technologies.
And what are you presenting on?
Yesterday I was here, and we gave a presentation about Indigenous rights and where the international law context is going, or where there's some hopeful stories about the protection of Indigenous rights and how that can be used for protecting lands and waters. And so today I'll be joining Susan. She'll set the stage by talking about renewables, and then I'll come in to talk about more the nuclear energy and law context, but how does it actually operate in Canada? What are the processes around that? What are the laws around that? And specifically looking at, if you are a member of an Indigenous community or a settler community, where are those kind of pathways where you can actually have a say and actually participate in those processes?
I want to talk about Point Lepreau for a second,
Sure.
or for many seconds, I guess. It is a topic of discussion at the moment. NB Power is under review, and even when the reviewers were here, they were speaking about how important Lepreau's purposeful function would be to the future of the utility. What are your thoughts about Point Lepreau and kind of, I think maybe NB Power putting a lot of its money on the operation of Point Lepreau and nuclear energy?
Okay. Well, when we think about energy technologies, especially these big thermal plants like nuclear plants, you have to think about sunk costs. So NB Power's problem is, I mean, they have basically a very poor performing reactor. I think everybody understands that. But they've sunk so much into it. They have a huge nuclear division, et cetera, and they just don't want to stop. This is the problem. They've got a whole cadre of people who were grown up basically within the organization with nuclear technologies, and they have these blinders on, and so they do not want to stop, even though now there are better alternatives available. And this is the problem, and they're still planning to put more nuclear technologies on the Lepreau site and sort of lock the province further in, they want to, for another number of decades, into a technology that's unfortunately for the industry failing around the world. It's not growing. It's the most expensive way to generate electricity, and so, but unfortunately NB Power is locked into it.
And how does it fit in the context, I guess, of your work?
Yeah, so it's interesting too, because globally, the nuclear energy share of like power supply has dipped 9%. It peaked 40 years ago. And so now if you look around the world, in the last 70 years of all the nuclear power plants that were operating, over a third now are in that end of life or decommissioning stage. And so that narrative doesn't fit with what we're hearing from the province, from the federal government too, who recently passed Bill C5, the Building Canada Act, and they have said, nuclear could be one of these projects that does get through this fast-tracked process to there's a one window approach to having approved and authorized and operating, and that goes against the trends we know from how nuclear power plants operate, which is, there's long delays in construction, there's huge cost overruns, and that's not just unique to New Brunswick, that is the industry as a whole.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the federal government. They've kind of prided nuclear energy as a nation-building project, but as you mentioned, it's the most expensive way to generate electricity. Why do you think Canada is putting its investment into nuclear energy as a nation-building project?
Well, Canada wants to be part of the nuclear club, basically, and this is the essential issue here. And I've done numerous access to information requests, and I have evidence where at meetings they say, well, we want to be at those tables. They want to be at the tables when the Iran deals are being discussed. They want to be at the tables when nuclear war is being discussed, all of those things. And to do that, they have to have nuclear reactors. And so Canada has this image, although that's an issue if you want to get into it, what our history is, but Canada has an image as being a leader in the peaceful use of nuclear power around the world, and they want to keep that. And it doesn't matter how much it costs, and this is the problem, because we are in a cost crunch here, and as everyone knows, concerned about NB Power bills, why would you invest more money in the most expensive technology out there that's just going to continue to increase the cost of power bills? So yeah, it's kind of a political bind that the government's in, and they have to make a choice if they want to stay part of this club or not.
Can I ask then, obviously monetarily it's expensive, but there must be other costs associated with focusing all your time on nuclear energy and not on renewable energy or other alternatives to energy.
Yeah, sure, I can talk about absolutely, because if you look at there are certain kinds of power plants like new hydro dams and nuclear reactors that take about 20 years from conception to being connected with the grid. And then you've got the newer technologies that are a lot less expensive, such as solar and wind, which is 3 to 5 years to connect with the grid from conception to actually operating. Of course, they have to be paired because they're variable technologies. They're paired with some kind of storage technology, but that also can be done in a shorter time. So what we're doing by locking ourselves into a long-run nuclear is we're putting off when we could be reducing carbon emissions, for example. We're putting off when we could be lowering power costs for ratepayers in New Brunswick. With these long times, and as Kerrie said, there's sure to be cost overruns.
And I think the time scale piece is so unique to nuclear, because when we think about the cost of nuclear, we're also thinking about the toxic cost. So radioactive waste is the most toxic pollutant we have on Earth. And so a decision to make new nuclear here in the province of New Brunswick, we have to think about, well, where does the waste eventually go? And so, Quebecois First Nation, they're an Algonquin nation along the Ottawa River, they are opposing the storage and burial of waste on their territory. And that's at the Chalk River site, which was kind of the birthplace of nuclear in Canada back in the 1940s and 50s. And, a decision here, the waste that's currently at Point Lepreau, they call it temporary storage because it's been here for decades, but the plan is to one day move it off-site across the country to a place that does not yet exist for its permanent storage. And so when proponents come forward and propose new technologies or even a further development here at the site, they're basing that on the assumption there will be something down the road. And this is waste that has to be overseen for hundreds of years because it is so toxic looking thousands of years into the future. And so a decision for nuclear now is a decision to think, well, is that what we want to send to our future generations for literally thousands of years?
Well, and we have seen success with Indigenous communities that have collaborated with utilities in New Brunswick. St. John Energy has a fantastic wind farm, the Birch Hill Wind Farm. Why do you think that they've been so successful? Is it because they're consulting with Indigenous communities and leaning on their knowledge? Or what do you think, why is there such a resistance to partnering with other organizations, other groups, Indigenous communities from the provincial utility, but not from the smaller utilities?
Okay, so NB Power's basic problem is nuclear doesn't mesh well with renewable technologies, right? And so they do not want renewables on the grid. And so they'd be willing to buy renewable power from wind farms that are co-partnered or fully owned by Indigenous communities. They'll happily buy that power. They don't want it on the grid, because what happens when the wind is blowing strongly or the sun's shining for days on end, those plants, those wind and solar plants, are producing power really, really inexpensively, like super inexpensively, a lot less expensively than the nuclear plant that is designed to run 24/7. So then if you have those plants on the grid, you have a problem as NB Power. What happens if part of your grid is producing this really cheap power and then you've got this nuclear running 24/7 that's really expensive? Well, you don't want to turn off your nuclear plant, right? It's only economical if you run it 24/7. So it just kind of messes up the grid. And this is why NB Power wants to stay a nuclear utility. It does not want to have these cheaper utilities on the grid because it kind of messes up their main plan. So this is the decision that they have to make. I just would like to point out that NB Power does not have the internal capacity to run the nuclear plant. They have a contract with the nuclear operator in Ontario to manage and oversee the running of the nuclear plant. And according to a recent CTV article, that contract is costing $29 million a year. Now that is crazy that we are running in New Brunswick a nuclear plant that we do not even have the capacity to operate. So that just tells you the situation we're in right now, which is we're kind of at a crunch point. We'll see where the NB Power review comes out of it, but they've got a decision to make.
But we keep saying it's running, but it's not running. I think
it's not running. It's down right now.
Yeah, I think Lori Clark says in 2026 it'll be down for 419 days. So that's a whole year. Yeah. Again, costing at about $1 million a day. Yeah. So there's consequences here that we're kind of just shoving to the side.
Yeah, I mean, I could just say a little bit more about that. And Lori Clark, the CEO of NB Power, has said explicitly that one of the reasons it's poorly performing is that when the reactor was refurbished and reopened in 2012, they didn't have the money to do the non-nuclear side. And this is just another indication that we cannot afford this technology in this small province. Anyway, it is what it is, but it's decision time.
Well, and the context of this is that, you know, many New Brunswickers live in energy poverty. And so we keep adding to this debt, we keep adding to the rate hikes. You know, I think this year they were considering 15%. So as they're considering all of these things, how does New Brunswickers continue to pay for energy that they can't afford?
And they'll be continuing to pay for decades down the road. So if you look at any nuclear power plant in Canada, when they were, you know, developed and the idea came to mind that, hey, we should have these CANDU reactors, there wasn't any consideration. It was not required by the law to think about the end of life. So how do you actually return that site to a healthy place, you know, when the doors close, whenever that may occur? And so we call that decommissioning, and that is a stage where it's a key concern globally as reactors are now entering this decommissioning phase. But from day one, there was no consideration given to, well, how do you store it? How do you manage it? And the cost associated with that as well. And so now we find ourselves at a place where our nuclear law in Canada is actually set up in such a piecemeal, compartmentalized way that even with Point Lepreau, the detailed thinking around how do you decommission it, how do you actually take the radioactive materials, and that's not just the fuel, which is the high-level waste, but also the contaminated building and site and soil. You know, where do you put that radioactive material? That detailed thinking hasn't happened yet, which is why Bill C-5 and the Building Canada Act is of such concern, because it wants to fast-track those approvals, and that approval process already is saying, you know what, if you want a license to build, we're just going to talk about building, and we're just going to talk about clearing the site, getting the gravel in, putting up a fence. You know, decommissioning and operations, we'll talk about that when we get there. But for us, decommissioning, if that's 40 years, 50 years down the road, you know, we aren't part of those conversations, and those have to be upfront conversations. And there is a way for that to happen under Canadian law. It's called an impact assessment. And this is what Prime Minister Carney is calling red tape and saying delays processes. Impact assessment is essentially a planning tool. It says, you know what, before we build this project, and it could be a nuclear power plant, it could be any project, let's get all the information in front of us. Let's look at, you know, all of the impacts, the downstream, the upstream impacts, the cost. Is it feasible? Is there a need for the project? Is it sustainable? Let's get all that on the table, have decision makers weigh in, and currently the Impact Assessment Act allows for Indigenous nations to be part of that process. Nuclear licensing does not have a role yet for Indigenous nations to be decision makers, and that's a main point of contention that many nations are still pushing for, is a seat at the table so their voice is heard. So in the impact assessment world, you're doing an upfront review of all of those factors and then deciding, is this actually a project that should be advanced? That doesn't apply to a lot of the projects that they're proposing at the New Brunswick Point Lepreau site.
Do we have an understanding of how nuclear energy has impacted our environment, specifically in the New Brunswick context?
Well, I just want to actually, I just would like to bring your attention to this report, if I may. It was a co-published report with our project at St. Thomas University and PRGI, the Passamaquoddy Recognition Group. And what this report does is it brings together Indigenous views on nuclear energy and radioactive waste from New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec, which are the three provinces that have been most affected by nuclear reactors. Of course, there's other Indigenous nations out west that have been gravely affected by uranium mining. So, in answer to your question, Nathalie, I would say that they have deeply impacted Indigenous communities and their sense of the integrity of their territory. This highly radioactive waste, which is going to impact not just the next 7 generations, but the next many hundreds of generations. And so their whole understanding of how to protect the environment and how to live sustainably into the future is being impacted by having this hazardous waste on the territory. The waste that's currently sitting on Passamaquoddy territory, hundreds of aging concrete silos about a kilometer from the Bay of Fundy that have been sitting outside, as Kerrie said, supposedly in temporary storage because there's no place to put them. This is the most radioactive material on the planet, and it's just sitting there. And the Pescatamakati, Chief Akaji has already said he doesn't feel comfortable sending it to another Indigenous nation in Ontario. I mean, why would he want that? So he's stuck with this, and he's thinking about this all the time. And so I would say that the immediate impact, especially on Indigenous communities, is the knowledge of having this on your territory and knowing that it's going to affect future generations for millennia.
Do they have a plan for I mean, I think you've mentioned that it's not quite clear what they're going to do with it, or it's going to a place that doesn't exist.
It's going to a place that doesn't yet exist. No approvals yet exist. And so there is a plan where all the nuclear operators contribute to, you know, the oversight of this waste and making a plan. But as of yet, that plan does not exist. And while Canada has a nuclear liability regime, it's very unlike, you know, pipelines. So if there was a spill from a pipeline, there would be unlimited damages, and the proponent would have to pay for that. In the nuclear industry, there's actually a cap. It is capped, and so it's actually Canadians across the country who are footing the bill for that liability, allowing nuclear power plants to continue operating.
NB Power has said that, you know, we're going to have a shortage of power in 3 years. We need the gas plant. We need the you know, I know a gas plant is not nuclear energy, but they're kind of, New Brunswickers are thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to have a shortage of power. Maybe we just need to get on board with these ideas. Do you think that this is maybe scaring people into thinking that this is the right option?
We've heard this before. Certainly this was the argument originally when they did the big nuclear build in Ontario. Possibly, I wasn't living in New Brunswick when Point Lepreau was originally built, but possibly the same argument was being made here. There's actually no evidence that that is going to take place, and I would just like to say that if they were concerned with an increase in you know, energy demand, there are other technologies available. It doesn't have to be nuclear. But there's also the interesting piece that you might be aware of, that we have a huge drain or a huge use on our grid by industrial users, like specifically J.D. Irving, for example, and they're talking about, they're actually lobbying for the government to change the Electricity Act that would allow them to build their own power to power their own plants. If it is possible in future for JDI and other companies to develop their own power and take themselves off the grid, we're going to have a lot less need for energy on the grid. I'd also like to point out that JDI is actually building a wind farm. They're not building a nuclear reactor to power their plants, which is what they want to do, because they understand that wind is the least expensive way to generate electricity, not nuclear power.
And so in an ideal world, in a perfect scenario, what is the future for nuclear energy and the province's utility?
We're living in a climate crisis. I think everyone understands that now. And so when you think about that, you want something that is responsive to the timescale when we need to respond to that. So Canada has committed to having its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. We're not on track to do that. Nuclear is definitely not going to allow us to meet that international goal, which is set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. The International Court of Justice, recently came down with a decision in the summertime that said those are legal obligations. Canada signed on to the Paris Agreement. Canada committed to, half its emissions by 2030. That's a legal obligation. So how are we going to get there? Nuclear takes us many years beyond that mark, even if it was to go through. And then we have to take a step back and say, well, hey, do Canadians, do people in the province here have a say in this? And when our governments, both provincially and federally, are rolling back the environmental laws and protections that are in place, protections to have a say, protections to have that information, that cannot be a starting point. That's a recipe for environmental injustice. And so a lot of my time is spent, helping these communities and helping people who are impacted by these injustices. And then the other part of my time is spent trying to prevent them. And how do you prevent that environmental injustice? It's making sure people have a say, have the information in front of them so they can participate. And that's the gap that is currently being created. So if these new technologies go ahead at Point Lepreau, it's going to be a very select few people who actually have a say. Decision makers who are already, beholden to the industry will be the decision makers making those decisions at the end of the day. So, yeah.
So the Point Lepreau nuclear plant, NB Power, has a license until 2032. That's when they would have to apply for a new license. That gives us, what, 7 years? Let's plan. Let's plan to shut it down in 7 years. We could use that 7 years to build out the alternative technologies. We could build out wind and solar, it's wind specifically, in 7 years to replace and overtake what is currently being generated, the 600 megawatts at Point Lepreau. So let's use that time now. Let's decide now to shut down the plant when the license expires in 2032, build out what we need in renewable energies, and then get into the decommissioning plan that Kerrie talked about. That's going to take another 50 to 100 years, but then we'll finally know what's happening, and there will be at least an opportunity to, aim towards some kind of what the closest that the Pescatamakati can get to a greenfield site at Point Lepreau, which is their traditional homeland that they would like to see as much as possible restored and being able to be used again.
I'm going to try to squeeze one more question in before I ask you for your final thoughts.
Okay.
For each of you, are there any specific recommendations that you will be looking for as part of that 3-panel review when it comes to the public?
Oh, yes. I would absolutely like to see them talk about putting renewable energy on the grid. That is an absolute must. I would like to see them say, we do not need that gas plant. We didn't talk about the gas plant. I could have talked about the gas plant. We don't need the gas plant. And to shut down the reactor at the end of the license period in 2032 and to work towards that now.
Yeah, to add to that, the other piece would be, as a foundation, ensuring that you have the free, prior, and informed consent of the Passamaquoddy Nation. That is the standard that's set out in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. The federal government has incorporated it into its domestic law. That has to be the starting point. Is there free, prior, and informed consent before any decision is made? Should it move ahead or not?
Any final thoughts from the two of you?
Well, just really enjoy the opportunity to talk about this, because one of the problems is that what we mostly hear from is the voices of NB Power in the government, and so those of us who are actually experts in the field don't often get the opportunity to share this information. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, it's been my pleasure to have you both here today. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nathalie.
My guests today have been Dr. Susan O'Donnell and Karrie Blaise. I'm Nathalie Sturgeon, and thanks for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.